all of the above options that we have to produce energy for America and the world in America.
See, Hogan, you're up. Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's cool. Biden administration needs to take the handcuffs off our energy producers. We can produce a lot more oil and gas. We do it with the best environmental stewardship in the world. But the Biden administration needs to take off the handcuffs. This is supply and demand. Look, less than 2 years ago, we were producing about 13 million barrels a day. Now we're down to about 11.5 million barrels a day. That's less supply because of the Biden administration's energy policies. My state alone, North Dakota, we were producing 1.5 million barrels a day. We're down to 1.1 million barrels a day. It's because of the energy policy of the Biden administration. You can't bring a restrictive energy policy that reduces supply and expect to get some relief in terms of prices at the pump or the availability of energy in this country, or even our ability to help our friends and allies in Europe as we're trying to help Ukraine as they face this horrible invasion by Russia. This makes no sense. How can the Biden administration tell the people of America they're trying to solve the problem when they are the problem? The Biden administration's energy policy is the problem. Take the handcuffs off our energy producers. Nobody does it better in terms of producing energy, in terms of producing oil and gas, than the American companies that are doing it. And I'll just run through the examples. You know what they are, but it starts with a moratorium on leasing on federal lands, both onshore and off. And then the Biden administration says, oh, well, no, they have these leases. Well, sure, but if you hold the lease up with regulation and court challenges, they can't produce them, can they? And that's exactly what they're doing. And they're slowing down permitting across the board with all these regulations and restrictions. And then they hold up our ability to move oil and gas around the country by holding up pipelines. 2015, I introduced S1. It was a bill to approve the Keystone XL pipeline. We passed it through the Senate. We passed it through the House. President Obama vetoed it. If he had not vetoed it, today that would be bringing almost 1 million barrels a day from our closest friend and ally, Canada. That's 830,000 barrels a day we don't have because of that energy policy. It's that simple, and they continue to do it. They're blocking our ability to move natural. We have stranded natural gas in our state, maybe in Oklahoma and these other states too. We can't get our gas to market because we can't get the permits for the gathering systems and the pipelines to move the product to market, let alone getting it to our allies. And we need LNG facilities to get it to our European allies so we can continue to cut off the Russian war machine. The way you cut off the Russian war machine is you cut off their ability to sell energy. And when they can't sell energy to Europe because we're providing it, then the Russian military has no funds. And when we cut off their funds, we shut down their economy. That's how we cripple their military and help our friends and allies in Europe and help Ukraine. It's as simple as that. This is not a complicated thing. It's simple. It's supply and demand. And the Biden administration needs to quit telling the American people that they're trying to help when they are the problem. How do you put forward a budget with $2.5 trillion in taxes, a lot of those taxes on our energy producers? What signal does that send? Does that tell the energy producers to go out there and invest and produce more energy? When you say we're going to tax the living heck out of you if you do? They need to change their energy policy. And until the Biden administration changes their energy policy, don't tell Americans that you're trying to help when your policy is the problem.
Well, if you're watching what's going on in the House right now, it's the closest thing to what you'll see as a show trial. It's kind of an annual rite of passage. They're bringing forward energy, oil and gas executives, and you guys all know what a show trial is. The subjects of the trial being publicly flogged for being guilty of something that is usually the fault of the very officials conducting the trial. By the way, look at the transcripts of the last show trial in the House. They were getting the energy executives of America to commit to producing less energy. That's what they were doing. Joe Biden, when he campaigned, said, "I'm guarantee we're going to end fossil fuels." That is actually one campaign promise he has tried to keep. You keep hearing about it from us because these are the facts. On day one, they moved out to keep Joe Biden's promise, stopping the production of American energy, particularly on federal lands, killing key infrastructure like Keystone and slowing down other pipelines, going to our financial community, strong-arming them not to invest in American oil and gas, begging dictators for more oil while guys like John Kerry were going to our allies, including in Japan, encouraging them not to buy American LNG. Think about that. Whose side is that guy on? Remarkable. The predictable result, we've all seen it, dramatic increases in energy prices for working families, particularly gas at the pump, pink slips for American energy workers, and empowering dictators. That's what's happening. So here's the deal, though, and this is a real problem for the Democrats. You're seeing it here in the House, or in the Senate and in the House. No one is being fooled by these show trials. I was home over the weekend. I want my colleagues to see that. That's my little poster board. Okay? Now, this is 100. I filled up my truck. My truck was actually 3/4 empty. So that was filling up my truck in Alaska, $109. Had it been fully empty, it would have been $142. To fill up the tank of one truck in America, devastating to working families, but nobody's being fooled. Nobody's being fooled. This is what literally was on the pump in my home state. Joe Biden, I did that. I did that, right? Nobody in America is being fooled. This isn't Putin. This is Biden. He did that. And if this show trial that we're going on in the House right now, we're actually trying to find the culprits of rising energy costs, the witnesses wouldn't be American energy executives. It would be this guy. It would be John Kerry. It'd be Gina McCarthy. It'd be Deb Haaland. Those are the people crushing the American working family with higher energy prices. Those are the people responsible for laying off patriotic American energy workers, like in my state. And those are the people who have been empowering dictators who produce energy as well. And as we're all seeing here, it's got to stop.
Well, when it comes to energy policy, common sense is needed, but unfortunately it's not that common here in Washington, D.C. when talking about energy policy. You've heard things like, well, the laws of supply and demand. Well, not even Joe Biden can repeal the law of supply and demand. Today, there are about 280 million cars on American roads that use gasoline, a petroleum product. And they got to run on something. And while in Texas, where Senator Cruz and I come from, we do believe in an all of the above energy policy. We produce more electricity from wind turbines than any other state in the nation. But each of these has a role to play in our economy. And right now, we're playing what has become a world-class sport here in Washington, D.C., which is called the blame game, without offering any real solutions to the American people. Things like reducing the having a gas tax holiday, so you pay 18 cents less per gallon on your gas. Unfortunately, what they don't tell you is that denies us access to the funds that are necessary to build roads and bridges on which your vehicle can ride. Games like, well, let's release 1 million barrels a day from the strategic petroleum reserves. If you unleash American energy, you can produce roughly 5 million barrels a day from one field out in West Texas called the Permian Basin. 5 million. But Biden tells you to be satisfied. We're really doing something about this by releasing 1 million a day. And as you've heard before, it's not producing new oil. This is oil that's already been produced and been stored for an emergency. And heaven forbid we would have a real emergency. But this has also become a national security imperative as well. We haven't talked enough about energy security, but you ask Germans, who I visited with on a recent trip to Germany and Poland, and they get it now. They realize they've been seduced into dependency on one source of oil, and that's Russia. And as you've heard from Senator Sullivan and others, President Biden's been sending this confusing message that, well, we don't want more American energy, but we do want OPEC, and we want the Saudis and the Russians to produce more. I mean, it's absolute chaos. We need to get back to basics when it comes to the law of supply and demand, and it starts with producing more domestic energy. We were a net energy exporter in 2017 before the Biden administration declared war on the American energy industry.
Since Joe Biden entered office, we've seen inflation skyrocketing, higher than any time in the last 40 years. And there's no aspect of inflation that is more painful for the American people than the inflation at the gas pump. The day Joe Biden took the oath of office, the average retail price of gasoline was $2.38 a gallon. Today, it's $4.16 a gallon. In some parts of the country, it has gone as high as $6.90 a gallon. That's not an accident. It is, in fact, the intended effect of political decisions made by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. It is also not principally the result of the war in Ukraine. It was instead the result of Green New Deal zealots in the Biden administration. Before Putin's tanks had rolled into even 1 inch of Ukraine, gasoline prices had already risen 48% because of Biden's misguided policies. Just like with inflation, the administration has had 5 stories on inflation. First, they said it didn't exist. Don't believe your lying eyes. Then they said it's transitory. It exists, but it's going away soon. Their third explanation was it's a high-class problem, whatever that means. Their fourth explanation was, yes, it exists. No, it's not transitory, but it's a good thing. Inflation is a sign of just how well the economy's going. And now they've settled on Putin, Putin, Putin. Blame it all on Putin. Every Democrat has that talking point. Well, you know what? The person principally responsible for the price at the pump is Joe Biden. Here's what Joe Biden promised in the campaign for president. He said, quote, no more drilling on federal lands, no more drilling, including offshore, no ability for the oil industry to continue to drill, period. Ends. He told you what he was going to do, and he did it. When it costs you $100 to fill the tank of your truck, that's Joe Biden's fault. When it costs $100 to fill the family's minivan, that's Joe Biden's fault. A whole series of policies. On day one, he canceled the Keystone Pipeline. The next week, he stopped all federal oil and gas leases, stopping development on what produces 24% of the nation's energy. On May 7th, Biden's Interior announced plans to take 30% of U.S. land out of production. On June 1st, Biden repealed leases on the North Slope of Alaska, totaling 16 billion barrels of oil. On October 7th, Biden eliminated Trump's permit streamlining regulations. On October 29th, Biden's Interior began using the, quote, social costs of carbon in permitting, a new kind of analysis designed to deny permits and stop production. On March 21st, just a couple of weeks ago, Biden's Security and Exchange Commission announced new regulations aimed at reducing investment in oil and gas, cutting off equity financing, and cutting off debt financing. This is Biden's fault, and the American people are hurting every day at the gas pump.
We had one thing to that as well. Then this last week, he announced 15 more taxes that he wants to be able to put on energy production. So it's been relentless in the process. Let me open this up for questions. What questions do you have? Yes, sir.
Senator, the questioning today in the House hearing, the Democrats drilled down on these executives.
So that's funny. It's drilled down on the oil executives. That's clever. Yeah.
Retrospectively intended. They drilled down on this question of capital expenditures, the fact that these companies are not investing in production. What policies would a Republican majority or Republican administration pursue to get these companies to invest in production rather than doing dividends and buybacks?
So stability is the key aspect there. What these companies are facing is they're saying typically I'm going to increase 2 to 5% of production. How much risk can I take when the Biden administration announced this week they're going to do 15 new taxes on me, when they continue to make production more expensive, when they're limiting access to lands through federal leasing, when they're going after capital costs and saying I'm going to make getting access to capital more expensive. They just want stability. Tell me what the rules are. For instance, what is the U.S. rule right now? No one has any idea. They've just set aside the old rule, and the Biden administration saying we'll get around to getting a new rule when we get to it. They will do more production. We've already seen that. We saw that during the Trump administration when they just did stability on the rules. Said we're going to leave it alone on the rules of the road and allow them to be able to then go invest. We can produce more energy when there's some stability and there's some plan. But when they're constantly tinkering with it and they know they're doing everything they can to punish more production, then why would you do more investment on that?
Can I take a shot at that, James? So it's the kind of flip back and forth policies and the show trial element of that hearing that in many ways is remarkable. They're saying you need to invest more in terms of capital. 6 months ago, these same House members were telling the executives, you need to commit right now to producing less oil and gas. Go read the transcripts. Then the Biden administration is strong-arming financial institutions not to invest, and then they're appointing, some of whom get confirmed, some of whom don't, federal officials whose focus is to starve the oil and gas industry of capital. Think about it. Raskin, she didn't get confirmed. The comptroller of the currency, Amarova, said she wanted to bankrupt small oil and gas businesses. And now you have the SEC chairman. Some of us talked to him. Hey, don't make your tenure all about starving capital to American energy companies. That was the one thing I focused on during his confirmation hearing. He said I wasn't going to do it. He did it. FERC, same thing. Go look at the hearing where Joe Manchin brought all 5 FERC commissioners 3 weeks ago in front of the E&R committee. Every single Biden administration nominee, confirmed or not, focuses on starving capital from the American energy sector, and then you have the House members audaciously say, why are you not investing? It is, to Ted Cruz's point, it is purposeful policy. And if you listen to Gina McCarthy and John Kerry, who, by the way, they've kind of put in a closet. You ever notice that? Now that the Ukraine war has broken out, they're like, we really need to shut these guys up. Thank God. But if you listen to them, prior to the war, they were actually saying increased energy prices will, quote, help us rapidly transition to a green future. This is purposeful. And the Dems are going to pay big time in November.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so a lot of the oil company CEOs at this hearing are saying, policy is part of it, but they're having manpower
That's right.
issues. There's a supply chain element, just like all aspects of this economy. And you guys kept mentioning supply and demand, right? I mean, I think a lot of people think, the analysts I speak with, prices, were high because people were back from the pandemic and driving, and supply couldn't keep up in time. So, I mean, is there a risk you're kind of, exaggerating Biden's role in this?
I would only say
it's more nuanced. There's a lot at play here.
the price of oil is always nuanced, and the challenge of it, what's happening at the price of the pump. we're not trying to oversell. We're just stating the facts that we've seen the last 14 months from the Biden administration. This was purposeful, deliberate policy to reduce the production of American energy. When the Biden administration sees the prices go up and he immediately goes to OPEC and to Russia and says, can y'all produce more? That was a deliberate decision to say, we don't want more production here, we want more production there. What he's putting on with FERC, what they attempted to do, that actually we pulled back in the ENR committee with FERC to be able to make it harder to be able to do natural gas pipelines, harder to do natural gas exports, that's a deliberate policy piece. Now, obviously there are other issues as well. A lot of the downhole pipe for drilling comes from Ukraine. And so that's a little tough to get downhole pipe right now when Ukraine's fighting for its life at this point. So I'm aware of that. There's also a big issue on trying to get labor. You're absolutely correct. Every business in America is trying to be able to get labor right now. So all of those are realities of production. But everybody, when they're looking to be able to invest, what they're going to do in the next level or what they're going to do on federal lands, if they're heavily invested into federal lands like it is in the West, and they're trying to figure out what they're going to do next, there's no predictability in that. And when there's no predictability, it drives it up. The flip side of this, by the way, I've already heard some folks in the Biden administration say he's announced this 180 million barrels of release, and look, the price has already gone down.
Okay, so Republican senators there talking about how high gas prices are in the country, responding to this hearing that happened on Capitol Hill earlier today where House Democrats accused oil companies of ripping off the American people and putting profits before production as Americans suffer from high gas prices. Representative Frank Pallone, he's the Democrat from New Jersey. He's the chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. He said, quote, at a time of record profits, big oil is refusing to increase production to provide the American people some much needed relief at the gas pump. So many of these executives faced pretty sharp questions, both from Democrats and Republicans alike today, including the CEOs of ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, and British Petroleum. So that was quite interesting today on Capitol Hill. Of course, we're going to take a quick commercial break with a preview of what to expect going into tomorrow. A lot is happening tomorrow. We'll have it after the break. Welcome back here to Live Now from Fox on this Wednesday night. I'm Andrew Kraft. It's been a pretty busy Wednesday. Just want to preview some things we'll be showing you tomorrow. We'll be carrying live, of course, at the United Nations. This vote will take place whether or not to suspend Russia from the United Nations Human Rights Council. We'll have that vote live also on Capitol Hill tomorrow. The final vote of confirmation for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson will be taking place on the Senate floor starting tomorrow. And Senator Schumer said he expects the vote to be around 1:45 Eastern. We'll have the vote live here on Live Now from Fox. Lastly, I just wanted to update our viewers on this story that we brought you yesterday. Remember, Capitol Police had captured a fox kind of roaming the grounds of Congress, biting some people. Well, earlier today, we got word that the fox had to be euthanized, unfortunately, because it had rabies. I'm going to read out this statement put out by D.C. public health officials saying that the lab there has confirmed the fox that was captured yesterday tested positive for the rabies virus. D.C. Health is contacting all human victims who were bitten by the fox. Animal Control will post informational flyers around Capitol Hill advising of the fox's positive rabies status and encouraging people who might have been exposed to call D.C. Health. This tweet coming in from Fox 5 DC's Tom Fitzgerald. So remember, one of those people who got bitten was a congressman, Representative Amir Locke. So the Fox saga, unfortunately, with a tragic ending there. I'm Andrew Kraft. Of course, we are going to show you some of these events we've already shown you throughout the day, including President Biden speaking to union members in Washington, D.C. But first, talking about his administration's response today about what they are doing to still hold Russia accountable, to keep the pressure on. Here's President Biden.
It's good to be home. Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You better stop. I'll start believing it. Please have a seat if you have one. It's good to be home. You know, I look out there and I see an awful lot of you who, as they say in Claymont, Delaware, who brung me to the dance. And I really mean it. There is no exaggeration. I'd not be standing here without labor, without union labor. Folks, as we used to say when I was a senator, if you excuse a point of personal privilege, before I turn to my main remarks, I'd like to have to briefly address the horrifying reports of the atrocities taking place in Ukraine and the steps the United States is taking to respond in close coordination with our allies and our partners. And I'm sure you've seen the pictures from Bucha and just outside of Kyiv. Bodies left in streets as Russian troops withdrew. Some shot in the back of the head with their hands tied behind their backs. Civilians executed in cold blood. Bodies dumped into mass graves. A sense of brutality and inhumanity left for all the world to see unapologetically. There's nothing less happening than major war crimes. Responsible nations have to come together to hold these perpetrators accountable. And together with our allies and our partners, we're going to keep raising the economic cost and ratchet up the pain for Putin and further increase Russia's economic isolation. Folks, the steps we've already taken are predicted to shrink Russia's gross domestic product by double digits this year alone. Just in 1 year, our sanctions are likely to wipe out the last 15 years of Russia's economic gains. And because we've cut Russia off from importing technologies like semiconductors and encryption security and critical components of quantum technology that they need to compete in the 21st century, we're going to stifle Russia's ability and its economy to grow for years to come. Folks, this is the United States. And we're taking additional steps in lockstep with our allies and partners to raise the economic pressure on Putin. First, the United States will impose full blocking sanctions on Sberbank, by far the largest financial institution in Russia, and Alfa Bank, its largest private bank. We're locking down any accounts, any funds that those banks hold in the United States. They'll not be able to touch any of their money. They'll not be able to do any business here. And second, I'm going to sign an executive order that's going to ban any new U.S. investment in Russia. More than 600 private sector companies. Folks, corporate America is stepping up and change. From McDonald's to Exxon, they've left the Russian market on their own accord. 600 of them. Think about that. The private businesses choosing to leave Russia rather than the risk being associated with Putin's brutal war. And this ban on investment is going to make sure that new money can't come into Russia to replace what's left, so that Russian economy doesn't feel the loss and the loss of these businesses for the long term. Third, we're adding more critical state-owned enterprises to the list of fully blocked Russian companies. These companies are major revenue generators owned by Russia and the government, which Putin uses to fund himself and enable his war in Ukraine. They'll also be cut off from doing any business with the United States. They'll not be able to access or use any assets they have in the United States. And fourth, we, along with our European allies, are adding the names on the list of Russian elites and their families that we're sanctioned. You see these yachts where they're being picked up? No, think about it. Think about the incredible amounts of money these oligarchs have stolen. These yachts are millions and millions of dollars. Look, these oligarchs and their family members are not allowed to hold on to their wealth in Europe and the United States and keep these yachts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, their luxury vacation homes, while children in Ukraine are being killed, displaced from their homes every single day. And finally, we're continuing to supply Ukraine with the weapons resources they need to defend their country. Last Friday, we announced millions in funding to procure new equipment for Ukraine. Advanced drones, laser-guided rocket systems. Yesterday, I signed another package to send more Javelin missiles, those shoulder-mounted missiles that can take out tanks and armored vehicles. To keep getting an uninterrupted supply to the Ukrainian military. You know, we won't be able to advertise every piece of security we give because our allies and partners are supplying to Ukraine through us. But advanced weapons and ammunition are flowing in every single day. And as you may have seen yesterday on television, when the Secretary of Defense was being cross-examined by one of our, how can I say it, our congresspersons, saying, "What have you done?" And he basically looked at him and said, "What the hell do you think we've done? Why do you think they're able to fight? We've trained them and we've given them the weapons." That's what's happening. Look, thanks to the bravery, the grit, and the fighting spirit of the Ukrainian people, Russia has already failed in its initial war aims. Russia wanted to take Ukraine's capital city, Kyiv, and topple its democracy and elected government. Today, Kyiv still stands, and that government still presides. This fight is far from over. Here's the point. This war could continue for a long time, but the United States will continue to stand with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people in the fight for freedom. And I just want you to know that. And by the way, if I got to go to war, I'm going with you guys. I tell you. I mean it. I want to talk about I want to talk about what I'm here today to talk about. You women or men and the American union movement. Remember, you know, when the Fair Labor Standards Act was first passed, everybody said you can have unions. It didn't say that. It says we should have more unions. We should. American labor, the building trades unions. President McGarvey, and by the way, Dad, Jack, where are you, Jack? I tell you what, Dad, as they say in Southern Delaware, you done good with this boy. And you know, I just know Jack's a Philadelphia guy. You know why? I just asked Sean, I said, where? He said, well, he's down the shore. Now, if you're from Philadelphia or Jersey, you go to the shore. If you're from northern Delaware, you go to the shore. A little bit further south, you go to the beach. You go to the beach. You can always tell where someone's from. And Dad, I asked whether or not you, like my wife Jill is from Philly, still talks about Broad Street, the Broad Street run, you know, and you know what you see, and you know, Jeet, yet, you know, I had to learn to speak Philadelphian when I got married. But Dad, it's an honor to meet you from a distance here. Thank you. Thank you very much. Look. It's good to be with you all, and I mean that. You know, there's an old expression, as I said earlier, you go home with them that brought you to the dance. And you folks brought me to the dance. And the people who brought me to the dance were union workers, not just workers, union workers. IBW, iron workers, boilermakers, teamsters, laborers, bricklayers, masons, plumbers and pipe fitters, painters, plasterers, roofers, operating engineers, steel metal workers. You're all represented in this room. And so many more who are not in the building trades that are union members across the country. I want to thank you for what you did to support my election this last time out. I remember going to a guy sitting down here a little further to the right when I refused to, I wasn't going to introduce my climate plan until I decided I was going to speak to a guy from the IBW, because I wanted to make sure you all knew what I was doing and why it not only was good for the environment, but good for labor. And I sat down with that guy right there, and he thought about it, and he went out and he talked to other people, and you all stepped up. And I mean it sincerely. You're probably the biggest reason why I'm standing here today. I've never forgotten not only what you've done for me, but more importantly, what you've done for this country. You're the ones who literally built this country, and that's not hyperbole. And you heard it 1,000 times when I was running for office, that we're going to build this economy, not from the top down anymore, but from the middle up and out. That's how you build America. Because we know that when the middle class does well, the poor have a way up and the wealthy are just fine. And that's exactly what we're doing. And by the way, the reason there is a middle class is because of unions. Unions. Fact. Unions. That's a fact. That's true. And look, not only you provide a good living, but what you do more than anything else, my dad used to say, you allow people to have dignity, the dignity of their work, to be treated with respect. When it comes time to rebuild the economy, before I did anything, as I said, I talked to you. I laid out my plan for economic growth. I talked with a lot of the folks sitting behind me here and others in the union movement. And with your help, it was a darn good plan. And look at the results. Our economy created 431,000 jobs in March. 7.9 million since I became president. More jobs in 14 months than any president in the history of America has ever created because of you. Unemployment's down to 3.6% from 6.4 when I took office. The fastest decline in unemployment to the start of the term of a president ever recorded because of you. And the economy grew 5.7% last year, the fastest growth in 40 years. I know people are still hurting. I'm not unaware of it. As my dad would say, every time that price of the gas went up at the pump, guess what? It was a conversation at our kitchen table that mattered. It affected outcomes. It affected what we did. But in the process, we were able to cut the deficit by $360 billion last year. And it's been a long, tough stretch, but Americans are back to work. Our economy has gone from being on the mend to being on the move. It started with the American Rescue Plan. When I took office in the midst of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. You all remember the lines of cars stretching for miles, waiting for a box of food to be put in their trunk. Not just poor folks, folks across the board waiting for that box of food. Because the American Rescue Plan helped 41 million Americans put food on their table. Because of the American Rescue Plan, we helped keep a roof over the heads of 4 million people. When you helped get that plan passed, 4 million people were on the verge of being evicted from their homes and apartments. That's a fact, not a joke. 4 million. The rescue plan put money in the pockets of hardworking Americans who thought, through no fault of their own, were in trouble, giving families what my dad used to call just a little bit of breathing room, just a little bit of breathing room. Because of the rescue plan, we had the best year of state and local growth in 20 years, adding back 467,000 jobs, and educators, firefighters, police officers who were laid off got back in the job. You made a gigantic difference. In addition, because of the rescue plan, 320,000 construction jobs last year. 320,000. You're building America again. I meant what I said. We're the only nation in the world that's come out of every serious problem we've had stronger than when we went in. And there are now more construction jobs today than we had before the pandemic. And leading financial firms, Moody's, Wall Street, estimates that because of the rescue plan, 4 million more jobs were created, and unemployment is 2% lower than it would have been had we failed to act. But look, that wasn't all we did to the rescue plan. We also included the law called the Butch-Lewis Act. You know what it is, most people don't. To ensure that we rebuild America, we upheld a promise to secure a dignified retirement for millions of workers and retirees all across America, protecting pensions. You all worked so damn hard for, you sacrificed to secure. And it didn't stop there, because We can't compete for the jobs of the 21st century if you don't fix our infrastructure. That's why it was so important to pass the bipartisan infrastructure law. You know, and now not only is it infrastructure week, infrastructure decade, infrastructure decade. No, real. Already. Already, as all of you know, we've announced nearly $5 billion to improve 3,000 airports across 50 states this year. We've announced $5 billion, including $650 million this year alone. So Lonnie Stevens and the IBW can get to work building a national network of electric vehicle charging stations, 500,000 across the country. We've announced $4.7 billion to cap and plug hundreds of thousands of orphan wells and gas wells spewing methane into the air, creating jobs as good as the jobs the folks dug those wells got paid in the first place. Same folks. Folks, nearly $17 billion for ports, waterways, and dams. 700 projects already announced across 50 states. $52.5 billion for highways and road repairs this year. $5.4 billion for bridges this year. The I-5 bridge over Columbia River in Washington State. The I-95 bridge in West Haven, Connecticut. The Jefferson Highway. US 61 East Baton Rouge Parish in Louisiana. There you go. The list goes on. Not only that, we're getting rid of poisonous lead pipes in 10 million homes and 400,000 schools and child care centers. So kids and families can have drinking water that doesn't poison them. Look, folks, this is America, the United States of America. We're investing $65 billion to deliver affordable high-speed internet everywhere in America, urban, rural, suburban, tribal communities. You can't be a country where a mother has to pull with her child up in her car to a McDonald's parking lot to connect to an internet so the kid can do their homework. I mean, think about that. It's the United States of America. Look, this law puts an end to that and creates thousands of jobs doing it. Good paying jobs. And look, what this means for all of you is jobs, good paying union jobs, jobs you can raise a family on, jobs you can't be outsourced. This is about more than rebuilding our infrastructure. It's about rebuilding our middle class. I'm so sick and tired. I was raised by a dad, not a joke, who when things would go bad, I remember we weren't poor, but we lived in a 3-bedroom split-level house with 4 kids and a grandpa living with us. And looking back on it, we thought it was great, but I wonder how my mom and dad thought about it. And I remember one night, true story, remember on my headboard, the bunk bed I was in, we had 2 sets of bunks in our room. And one was up against the wall that divided between my mom's bedroom and ours. And I could tell my dad was restless. I could hear him. And I asked my mom the next morning, what was the matter? He said, he just found out we lost our insurance, honey. We lost our insurance. Well, guess what? You are the ones who keep millions of people from losing their insurance. Unions built the middle class. We have to rebuild the middle class. That's why we made sure that the infrastructure law included significant labor protections. For example, the overwhelming majority of the funds included in this law are subject to Davis-Bacon requirements. And by the way, as you may remember, when the President Obama asked me to do the Recovery Act back in our administration, the previous one, we didn't do any you guys didn't do. If they wanted the money, they had to show me that they were doing it and paying a prevailing wage. As you know, that means folks who are rebuilding the country are going to earn a prevailing wage now. And by the way, the Labor Department, led by a proud former president of the Labor's Union 223, Marty Walsh. Good man. If I'm in a foxhole, I want Marty next to me. Look, he recently proposed a new regulation to strengthen prevailing wage. Another thing the law does is help expand registered apprenticeships. Wasn't it wonderful when business said, don't worry, we'll do the apprenticeships? Wasn't that a great, generous thing for them to do early on? Well, come on, man. Union partnerships that allow workers to earn while they learn, that matters. Because laying a strong foundation for the future of this country is about more than having strong roads and bridges, ports and airports that can compete with any in the world. It's also about making sure that here in America, folks who work hard and live their lives, they have an opportunity to live it with dignity and respect. That's what unions are about, in my view, about providing dignity and respect for people who bust their neck. That's why I created the White House Task Force on Worker Organization Empowerment, to make sure the choice to join a union belongs to workers alone. And by the way, Amazon, here we come. Watch. Well, it's why I've called on Congress to finally pass the PRO Act and send it to my desk. That's why we're strongly encouraging grantees to get infrastructure funding to use what we know as the project labor agreements. You know what they are. The vast majority listening to this won't know. Which helps ensure the people building major projects are well-trained, highly skilled workers who have a voice on the work site. Look, you all know why this matters. Union members get higher wages and benefits like health care and insurance and paid leave, protections against discrimination and harassment, safer, healthier workplaces. But there's another reason, the basic American reason. Workers who join a union gain power, the power over decisions that affect their lives. When you've got a union, workers' voices are heard and heeded. Unions provide, in one word, democracy in the workplace. Organizing, joining a union, that's a democratic and democracy action. Unions aren't just good for workers who join them. Rebuilding America with union labor is smart for business and the American public and for our entire country. Union workers, and I'm not just saying because you're sitting there, but give me my word, you're the best in the world at what you do. Highly skilled, highly trained. You've got a voice in the workplace, a sense of ownership in the project. When union workers are on the job, projects are completed efficiently and they're completed professionally. That's good for the American taxpayer. It's good for families in every neighborhood where infrastructure projects are underway. And so we're going to keep investing in you and your families. We can and we must do more. For example, there are nearly 1.2 million extremely qualified women who haven't returned to the workforce. There's a simple reason. There's no affordable child care for them. Many families pay up to, in this city and other major cities, they have up to $14,000 a year for one child. When I got to the Senate, as some of you know, right after I got elected in November, and December 18th after that election, I got a phone call saying my wife and daughter had just been killed. A tractor trailer broadsided them, and my two boys weren't supposed to make it. My boys did make it, thank God. But the point was, everybody thinks I commuted every day because I was this good father wanting to go home. That's true. But I couldn't afford daycare. So I had my mom and my sister and my brother. I had to do it from home. I had no choice. And I was making a good salary. I think at the time we were making $42,000 a year, which was a fair amount of money. I couldn't afford child care. And these women can't afford it either. If you cap child care, as I proposed, at 7% of a family's income making less than $125 grand a year, you could cut in half the cost of child care, saving thousands of dollars and freeing so many people to be able to go back to work, particularly these women who are totally qualified but have no alternative but to stay home. Or take prescription drugs like insulin. Many of you know people who have type 1 diabetes, another reason for insulin. You know how much it costs to make that vial of insulin? $10, T-E-N, $10. But you see families paying, on average, over $641 a month for that insurance, up to $1,000 a month. Think about those 200,000 kids out there, maybe some of your children, who have type 1 diabetes. 200,000. Think about what it does to a parent who looks at their child, doesn't have insurance, doesn't have the cash, and wonders, my God, what am I going to do? Have no idea how we're going to pay for what we need so desperately. It not only puts the child's life in jeopardy, it strips you of your dignity. How can you look at your child knowing they need this, but there's no way you don't qualify for it because you're making some money, but you don't have enough money to pay for that monthly bill? It's easy. We can cap insulin at $35 a month. They'll still make 350% profit. Look, there's so much more we can do if we let Medicaid be able to do what they do. Those of you who are veterans, they negotiate. Veterans Administration negotiates with Medicare for the price they charge. It's a big deal. They still make a lot of money. But what's going on now, we can do it all without adding to inflation. We don't have to believe me about that. 17 Nobel laureates in economics within the last 6 months wrote to me independently and said, guess what? If you do what you're talking about, it will not only not increase inflation, it will reduce the impact on inflation. We can do this without raising a penny in taxes on anyone making under $400,000. We have to do it. All we have to do is ask the wealthiest Americans among us in major corporations to pay their fair share, just a little bit more. Really, not a joke. Not a joke. I made a commitment. No one making less than $400,000 in my administration while I'm president will pay a penny more in taxes. That's why I held up the passage of the infrastructure bill. They wanted to add a fee for highways. I said, no, ordinary people are going to be paying for that. I'm not for that. We got to have everybody chip in and pay their fair share. Look, folks, there's no reason why someone making $10 million a year should pay a lower tax rate than a married couple who are a firefighter and a school teacher. But that's how it works. I mean, for real, there's no reason why in 2020, the 55 of the companies, Fortune 500 companies, paid zero in federal income tax, and they made $40 billion. Zero. Zero. Look, I'm a capitalist. If you can go out and make $1 million or $1 billion, go at it. But for God's sake, chip in and pay your fair share. I think a lot of my friends are registered Republicans living out there. They think that too. I mean, it's just so outrageous. That $2 trillion tax cut, the last guy. What was his name? Anyway, the last guy. I forgot it. He never showed up for the inauguration. But anyway. But all kidding aside, I shouldn't kid. But that tax cut basically went to the top 0.1% of the American public. And it didn't grow the economy. Look, the bottom line is this. The United States is in a position to outcompete the world once again. If we can keep coming together, invest in the backbone of America, there's no limit on what we can achieve. When I wasn't going to run again, as some of you know, some of my friends. But when I finally decided to run, and my kids encouraged it because, anyway, I won't go into that, but if I finally decided to run, the fact of the matter is, I made a judgment. We just had there's no reason why we have to keep it the way it's been. When's the last time trickle-down economy has trickled to anybody you know. No, I'm serious. I'm not joking. I'm not joking. So look, I said I was running for 3 reasons back then. 1, to restore the soul of this country. And by that I meant decency and honor and honesty in what we're going to do. And 2, to rebuild the backbone of America. To rebuild the backbone of America, which is the middle class and working people. And 2 and 3, to try to unify the country. That's been the hardest thing so far. Not a joke. But we're going to get there, because you can't have a democracy function unless you can generate consensus. You ultimately have to unify it, as angry as I sometimes get. So look, America, this is a fact. America's always counted on union workers. And given just half a chance, you have never, ever, ever, you've never let the country down. We're counting on you again. And you can count on me to keep fighting for you, I promise you. And folks, let's continue giving working families a fighting chance. Let's face the challenge ahead. And let's keep building a better America. And one last thing. We're announcing today an investment through the infrastructure law. The largest investment in public transit in American history, $20.5 billion. It's going to accomplish 2 big things. Create more good union jobs using products made in America and reduce pollution at the same time while making it safer and easier for folks to get to work. Let's keep going. Let's keep building. Let's keep it on the way. Thank you, thank you, thank you. May God bless you. And may God protect our troops. Thank you. Thank you. I don't want to go.
Joining me now to discuss all of this even further, national security expert Hal Kemper. Hal, as always, so good to see you on this Wednesday night. We'll get into the new sanctions that were announced today. We kind of touched on them a little bit last night. First, though, I want to talk to you about what is seemingly the disdain Russia has for its own fighting force. There are reports that the Russian troops that were in and around Kyiv that have retreated, they're going to be used in the intense fighting we're about to see in the eastern part of the country, the Donbass region. And some have kind of attributed that to essentially shielding them from accountability and responsibility in the massacres that were carried out that we've been seeing in order, basically, Putin's thinking, these troops will die in combat and they won't have to be held accountable. What say you on that?
Well, there was a report yesterday, Andrew, that said exactly that. It said one of the mechanized infantry brigade, rifle brigade, that was actually in Bucha, all right, where a lot of the atrocities were found, where people were found bound and executed, there were mass graves, that brigade was literally picked up, retrograded out of the area, and is being put right back into the fight in eastern Ukraine, right on the front. And according to Ukrainian intelligence, it was specifically to put those who had committed atrocities and those who had witnessed atrocities on the front lines, with the hope that they would be killed in combat. Now, one thing I will say is the Russians have been leaving their dead and actually leaving their live troops all over the battlefield. They were, even before this whole thing kicked off, they were leaving troops in train stations for weeks unaccounted for during the administrative movement. Once they got into Ukraine, during the retrograde, there were troops that were covering the withdrawal that suddenly looked around and there was nobody there. And they ended up having to surrender because they'd been left. They basically, their forces fell out. Now, there could be a lot of reasons for that. One of which is they're so fearful of the Ukrainians that they just quit taking chances on the battlefield. And they're too scared to risk their lives to recover their dead and wounded or to recover units that are cut off in combat. The other side is just a callous disregard for the safeguard of their troops. All of this is leading to that issue of morale. And this has become a cancer, a growing cancer within the Russian forces. Is morale it's not low. It's just it's at the bottom and it's digging a hole, and it gets worse and worse and worse every day because of things like this. The feeling that troops have that their chain of command really doesn't care about their well-being. It isn't really dedicated to the mission, and frankly, they don't have a lot of dedication to the mission, and the idea that they don't have the right forces to prevail. So it's having an impact.
Yeah, and Hal, Moscow initially sent 75% of its main ground combat forces in total and committed them to this war back in February. The Pentagon says much of that army of about 150,000 troops is now a spent force, with including logistics problems, like you mentioned, flagging morale and devastating casualties. When are we going to see, you think, evidence of this? Or maybe, maybe we are, but when are you going to see concrete evidence of this, meaning that it has an impact on the battlefield? We've seen that Kyiv is essentially free still. It has not fallen since the war began, but no more troops, Russian troops, are surrounding it, are encircling it. But what more evidence can we see with our own eyes that the Russian retreat is real?
Well, I have to tell you, the Russian retreat, it's amazing. If you look at the map behind me, you'll see, I'll turn my head a little, you see Kyiv right there, but you also see Sumy. The latest maps that have come from the Institute for the Study of War show the Russians have pretty much pulled out of all those, well, they call them oblasts, but these provincial areas. They have pretty much pulled out and gone up to Russia and Belarus, and they're gone. I mean, there's still remnant forces there, but they're basically pulling out. It's a disengagement on a scale that's truly stunning when you looked at the number of forces they had in there. Now, they're supposed to be moving them off to the east, but most experts looking at this don't think they can really reconstitute those forces, that they are so battle damaged, the attrition is so heavy that they don't see any time soon that these forces will be reintroduced. Now, there is an expectation that within the Donbass region, Russia will initiate some sort of offensive action very soon, within the next few days, possibly. But there's also a feeling that that offensive action probably won't get very far because the Ukrainians are simply, they're dug in. They've got a great defense. They've been holding them off this time. And there really isn't a whole lot of additional combat power that Russia is able to bring to bear. In fact, some of the forces that they brought up from Georgia, from South Ossetia, which are down there, essentially it's an occupation force in Georgia, from when they invaded that Georgia in 2008. They brought a couple of battalion tactical groups up, and reportedly the battalion tactical groups refused to fight. They refused to go into the fight, and eventually they carted them up and sent them back to South Ossetia to continue with their peace enforcement, peacekeeping mission, or whatever it was down there. I can tell you, back in the Stalin times, they probably would have lined up the whole battalion and shot them. But they're so desperate for troops that there are numerous reports coming out of troops of entire units refusing to fight. And what's interesting is that there isn't some draconian action being taken against them. They were just simply redeployed somewhere else, almost as if a tacit command recognition that things are so bad they can't really give an order to some of their military units to go fight and expect that order to be carried out. So that to me, the consistency of the reports on that, to me, tell me that the attrition is so bad. I don't know if Russia really has the ability to recover. There's a good chance that 150,000, and this is just doing math, of that 150,000, almost half maybe of those troops may be out of the fight due to being killed, wounded, surrendered, desertions, or something else where they just simply refuse to go back into Ukraine. That's a stunning number, to have almost half your forces or half your troops not be able to be deployed. And of course, as we mentioned, they went all in. 75% of those operational combat units, ground combat of the entire Russian army, were committed up front, and now they're stuck. There's really not much in reserve.
And of course, those figures, those statistics dovetail with just the grim statistics we're getting on a civilian scale. We heard a confirmation of a really horrifying number today from the mayor of Mariupol. 5,000 civilians, he says, have been killed since the war began in Mariupol. And granted, we heard from John Kirby, Mariupol has not, fallen to Russian forces. Part of the city still stands. I believe there has been efforts among the Russian forces to install some type of, puppet local government there as, kind of a face-saving measure there. But the fight for Mariupol still stands. Hal, let's talk about U.S. support, U.S. response. We heard from Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin yesterday disclosing the training for the first time when he was speaking to members of the House Committee on Armed Services. So that was quite enlightening there. He described how U.S. officials are instructing a cadre of Ukrainian troops to use them on the battlefield. What do we know about this training? Where is it taking place? How long has it been going on? Because this is, this is direct military involvement, I guess, by proxy for the U.S. military into the war in Ukraine. Would you characterize it as such?
I think that's you could say that, kind of. What's interesting is, and that did come out today, I'm not quite sure. I think it's probably, I'm in California. I think the training's actually happening here in California. I'm not sure. AeroVironment is based out of Southern California. It's based out of the LA area. And there's a number of places out here where I think they would probably do this training. I think it would be one of the big Marine Corps bases probably would be a great place to host a training. But that wasn't entirely clear to me when I was reading it, where they're doing it. But the fact is, they had Ukrainian officers or Ukrainian troops here in the U.S. getting that training. I would have thought that training probably would have happened in Eastern Europe. But I think because they need tech reps, that the challenge is the challenge with AeroVironment. And I made some calls, people who are very familiar with them when it came up to just see where everything is. Problem is, suddenly everybody needs Switchblade drones. I mean, they're a fantastic system. They're perfect for what the Ukrainians are doing to the Russians, but they just weren't in the procurement cycle where they had a production line that was pushing these things out at the numbers that they really needed them. So when you look at the training, I'm assuming that they had to rely on what we call tech reps, technical representatives from the company. And that would lend itself to having them here in the United States. And since the company is based out of Southern California, they probably want the tech reps to be close to the company headquarters so they could do things back and forth as needed and maybe get additional Switchblades out there for training or whatever it is. So I'm thinking that's probably where it took place. I don't know. I will tell you, first off, from what's been said so far, it wasn't entirely clear. I just found it was fascinating. They're actually doing the training here in the United States, which gives you an idea of some of this. It's not hidden logistics. It's just not logistics or advertised in terms of moving Ukrainian personnel in other countries to get them training, to help them with other equipment. You know, we hear so much about the Soviet equipment in Eastern European NATO countries are being moved over to Ukraine, but we don't often hear all this other stuff. I would say with the Switchblade, it looks to me from what I've seen that the Brits may have been doing something similar with one of their anti-aircraft missile systems, the Starstreak system, that was recently put into action. And they may be doing that as well. And there may be training like that that's occurring probably in Eastern Europe, though, with NLAWs and maybe Javelins. But there's enough incumbent knowledge with those two systems, I think, in Ukraine that they can actually train themselves since they're so familiar with those systems. But fascinating. I just, I think the last order I saw, and I don't know, I saw one article said 100 were going in. Okay, that's nice, but it's a one and done deal. You shoot one and that's it. That's all you get. And then there were several other articles that said 10. I got to tell you, 10, I mean, a squad can carry 10 of those things in their trucks and go out there. That's just not a huge number. And, 10 of those are great, but we should be shipping 1,000 of those, or 2,000. It should look like the Javelin number. So the production cycle is just not where it needs to be.
Okay, we'll get our viewers a better estimate on the number that is going over there. Let's talk about Russian energy, Russian oil. We heard from Volodymyr Zelensky in his nightly address that European allies need to find more determination to get their energy elsewhere, to borrow it if need be from elsewhere. We also learned that Europe is, they are taking this, they are heeding this advice slowly, but it seems like some support is coalescing in Europe about weaning itself off of Russian energy and oil. How drastically remains to be seen.
I think what you're going to see, and what you are seeing, is they're trying to get themselves off of oil. Of course, they're very dependent on Russian oil. They're extremely dependent on Russian natural gas. And I think that's part of Putin's planning process was he says they can't get rid of that. They can't replace that natural gas thing real fast. They're doing the best they can, I think, with what they are able to absorb. And they're trying to get rid of that. But what we're seeing is there is investment going into, finally, it's taken a little while, but there's investment going into developing new fields. But that takes a long time to take a field and put it into production. What you're really seeing is a lot of investment, especially government investment in Europe and here in North America and the US, that's going into renewable energy, other energy sources, and that is being accelerated. And some of that has the potential of being fleeted up, as we like to say. You can ramp it up a little bit quicker. In fact, in some of the renewable energy areas, you can probably ramp that production line, if you will, in terms of the equipment and things that they need, actually probably faster than you can put some oil fields and oil capability into effect. I spent a little bit of time up in eastern Montana and North Dakota where they have those huge shale oil fields. The problem with COVID was when the prices dropped, demand dropped, a lot of the people that worked up there and lived up there, those fields got shut down because they're no longer economically productive. So they basically got, basically temporarily shut down, but the people moved. And now the problem is getting the skilled workforce back in place to open that whole thing up, to get that moving. It just takes time. It's not something where you can turn a switch and it comes back on. That's some of the challenges they're dealing with. And that's not just in the Midwest in the US, that's elsewhere around the world. And a lot of that oil, especially from the Middle East and other sources, it's really spoken for. So it's a challenge.
Hal, just last question for you, and I meant to ask this when we hit the 1 month mark of the war, but remember President Biden had said essentially that the sanctions impact and effect will really be felt 1 month in. We're now 42 days in. We also got word more sanctions are being levied today on two very high-profile, prominent banks in Russia, and kind of these second, third tier, third order sanctions as well on family members of high-ranking Russian officials like like Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. Are you seeing the effect, or are you seeing parts of the Russian economy, bubble up again, kind of have a rebound effect, or is it still damaging?
It is damaging, Andrew. There have been impact, but you're absolutely right. And some of the key indices, they went way down, and then there was a little bounce back. Now, one of the ones that's a little bit of that a number of experts have been looking at, a number of traders looking at, they look at the ruble, and they look at, the ruble was losing all of its value, and then it bounced back. But the ruble's value is based on what? It's non-exchange currency. It was floating based on the good faith and credit of Russia, which there is no good faith and credit of Russia. One of the ways Russia's been trying to offset this is to kind of do an oil and gas version of Bretton Woods, where the U.S. dollar used to be pegged to the value of gold. Well, they were trying to do that with gas and oil with Europe to say, you pay for this in rubles, which increases demand in rubles, but also gives them the opportunity to set a price in rubles for gas and oil, which would actually be an artificial price or valuation of rubles in the international market, since they're not exchanged in the international market. That hasn't worked out for them. They've tried to do that, but in so many things, it is really having an impact. I will tell you, though, the impact is on Russia. The impact's on the rest of the world, though. The sanctions are having an impact, but the war itself is blocking wheat and other foodstuffs from getting out of Russia and Ukraine. That right now is having repercussions in the Middle East, which is heavily dependent on wheat from that area for bread. And you may recall the Arab Spring actually kicked off because of the price of bread spiking so high that people couldn't afford it. There's a lot of concerns that we're going to see second and third order effects. So whereas this thing is having an impact in Russia, it's definitely cutting them off from being a true participant in the global economy in the way they had been. There is a counterweight, which is it's also having an impact everywhere else. And so we're not sure about the second and third order effects.
So much to discuss, so much to talk about. As always, Hal Kempfer, thanks so much for being our guiding light and making sense and providing clarity in this war in Ukraine. We'll talk to you again.
All right, Andrew. Talk to you again. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Law permitted us to file criminal charges in Amir's death. And in so doing, we had to evaluate all the evidence to Minnesota's use of force statute, which is rooted on a 33-year-old Supreme Court precedent called Graham versus Connor. As we announced this morning, we have determined that under the precedent and the laws that we have, we cannot file criminal charges. Current law only allows us to evaluate the case from the perspective of a reasonable police officer. And that language is from the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and relevant cases and statutes. We're not allowed to evaluate the case from the perspective of the victim. With all of the available evidence, we would not be able to prove in court that Officer Henneman's use of force was not authorized under the law beyond a reasonable doubt. It would be unethical for us to file charges in a case in which we know that we will not be able to prevail because the law does not support the charges. And still, and yet, a loving, promising young man is dead. His death leaves us with a wound in our community, but that is small in comparison to the wound that his family is suffering from. Communities have been torn apart by the trauma yet again, and the life of a police officer has been changed forever as well. If the law does not allow us to file criminal charges in this case, what can we do as policymakers, prosecutors, society, community, to keep a death like Amir's from happening again? First, we need to interrogate whether no-knock warrants are ever really needed. There are inherent risks for everyone involved, including civilians and officers. Cities like St. Paul and even some states have stopped using them, and it hasn't hurt public safety. Yesterday, Mayor Frey issued another no-knock policy, which appears stronger than the previous one. Now this policy needs to be actually enforced and obeyed. Then maybe Minneapolis can get the results like St. Paul, which hasn't used a no-knock warrant since 2016 with no harm to public safety. Second, Congress must pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. I don't mean someday, I mean now. We need state and local actions as well, including enacting the rest of the recommendations of the working group to deadly force encounters that Commissioner Harrington and I released more than 2 years ago with the inspiration and advice from County Attorney Freeman. Third, Minneapolis leaders need to talk about putting an end to in-custody deaths this way, but we need to get serious about doing it. The problems involving policing and communities of color in Minneapolis are long-standing and everyone knows it, yet it feels like nothing ever is done about it. Finally, as prosecutors, we need to continue to hold offenders accountable and uphold the law and uphold standards of justice. The fact is, as I've said before, we'll uphold the principle that no one is above the law and no one's beneath it either. And with that, I think we're prepared to, unless you want to make some more remarks.
Amen.
Thank you very much.
All right. Our first question comes from Omar Jimenez from CNN. Do you plan to speak with the Locke family at all? If so, what is your message to them after what they may see as a disappointing result here?
The Attorney General and I spoke with the Locke family at length this morning. They are fine and decent people who are full of grief. And we expressed our personal sympathies and empathies with the family. They, like us, are very frustrated with no-knock warrants. They, like us, believe that if a no-knock warrant hadn't been used, Amir Locke might well be here today. Other than that, I think it'd be inappropriate to comment other than we had a long conversation, and I know they will continue the effort and the work that Keith has talked about, trying to make our society safer and to remedy some of the racial inequities that exist in our criminal justice system.
All right. Our second question is from Lou Ragoose at KARE 11. Thank you for providing additional detail in the frequently asked questions. My question for Mr. Freeman and Mr. Ellison after reading these reports, would you agree that officers have pretty wide-ranging authority to kill during these kinds of warrants to an extent that a large segment of the population is uncomfortable with?
Well, what we would say is that the area of warrants needs reform. I'm glad that the city of Minneapolis mayor issued a revised policy that is stricter than the last one. But I would agree that there's very broad discretionary latitude. I will say that it calls for reform, and I think it's appropriate for a community to engage to have a policy that's going to preserve life for everyone involved. I will add this. No-knock warrants aren't particularly safe for officers either. They have attendant risks on both sides, civilians and officers. So it's appropriate to investigate and to come up with policy that works.
Our next question is from Esme Murphy from WCCO. Can you address who the independent expert is and what access did he have to investigative files and other resources? And how often have you done something like this, hired an independent analyst?
Our independent expert was retired Captain Jack Ryan, a police expert in deadly force. He had access to all of the evidence we did, including the body-worn cameras, the statements by the police officers, the search warrant. He did a thorough, complete, and independent review of this. Jack Ryan has been involved in cases in Minnesota before. And at least several of those cases, he's been quite critical of the Minneapolis Police Department and actions of the police officers. But in this case, he agreed with the conclusions that Keith and I and our staffs arrived at independently, that the law and the facts did not support a prosecution of Officer Hanneman in this case.
All right, our next question is from Steve Karnowski from the AP. Did Amir Locke have a carry permit as his family has said?
That issue it wasn't relevant to our analysis. His family has said that, but because it didn't really matter, he was in a home, he was in lawful possession of the firearm. He was not a person who couldn't have a firearm. So, that issue, while I know it was raised in the press, ultimately doesn't impact the decision in this case.
Our next question is from Andy Mannix from the Star Tribune. Does the body footage for Hanneman support the claims that Locke was pointing at him? When will we see the rest of the footage?
To answer the latter part first, the body-worn camera video will all be up on the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension's website today, if it's not up already. The body-worn camera footage for Hanneman and the other officers show the gun that Amir Locke was holding at the time he was shot. It shows that Amir Locke was holding it by the butt of the gun in a shooting position, although his finger was not on the trigger. That gun was pointed directly at Officer Hanneman. During the body-worn camera, it seemed to dip down a bit and then come back up. And that's confirmed by both the officer statements and the body-worn camera, which you can see later today.
If I may add, the term pointing might imply a level of intentionality that we don't know whether Amir Locke had or not. We don't know what was on his mind. It could have been an inadvertent moment. We don't know if he was pointing it, but the video does indicate it was pointed in the direction of Officer Hanneman.
Good clarification.
Our next question is from John Collins with NPR. Why not let jurors decide whether the evidence shows that the officer's actions were, quote, reasonable?
Now, as a prosecutor, you have an ethical responsibility to not bring charges when the law and the evidence show that you can't prevail. We have the burden. We have to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. And it is our conclusion that we cannot prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt that the officer's actions were unreasonable. This is an important justice matter because you don't want to put anybody on trial for a case simply to meet public demand. It has to be a ethical consideration based on prosecutorial ethics, and that's what we're abiding by.
I've received a question that says, what department was Jack Ryan with? Was he with MPD?
I do not believe Jack Ryan was ever with MPD. I do not recall exactly which departments he may have been at. That, again, is on the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension website. His vitae is there. I just don't recall that.
Our next question is from Scott at Minnesota News Network. Even though you acknowledge the law and facts don't support charges in this case, what is your message to Minneapolis community members, particularly those of color, who see this decision as another example of police getting away with murder?
I'd say, first of all, we understand how you feel. This is a heartbreaking situation. We have a situation here where a young man is dead. There's no evidence that he was ever a suspect or that he ever intentionally tried to harm the officer. And yet we have a very unsatisfactory situation here, but we have to abide what the legal standards are. The fact is that the struggle goes on. We can make reform in the area of criminal justice reform. We can make reform in the area of no-knock warrants, police procedure. We can continue. There's still a viable civil matter here. There are a number of things community can and should do to carry forward. And so this is not the time for people to feel like there's no hope. There is. People should carry forward and continue to try to make the system one we can all be proud of.
All right. The next question is again from John Collins, as we haven't received any others from different news outlets. Does statute 609.066 need to be revised?
That's a very complex question. We asked police officers if shots are fired to go towards the shots when the rest of us as civilians go away from it. Because we asked police officers to take steps to protect us, they have rights under statutes like 609.066 to use deadly force when they are confronted in a situation where a reasonable police officer who is not part of that situation at the time believes that there's a plausible threat and that a use of deadly force is required. That's based not only in the Minnesota statute, but the federal constitution and a whole series of federal case laws. What I think we can try to do that perhaps will accomplish some of the reforms that Keith and I are both talking about and want to occur is to make sure that officers are less often in situations in which they're confronted and they think they have to use deadly force, and to make sure that officers are thoroughly and completely trained to use deadly force as only the last resort. I think we have work to do in both of those areas.
Let's see. We have one more question. It looks like from Lou Regrus at CARE 11. Under the apparent circumstance of Amir Locke waking up with a gun and potentially believing this was a home invasion, what would have taken for charges to be appropriate in this case?
You know, I do appreciate Lou's question, and I understand why he's asking it. It simply is beyond the scope of our mission. It would require us to speculate, and I don't think that is the right thing to do at this time. I think this is probably a good time to wrap up.
Yeah, let me just say in conclusion, I agree. It looks like we've answered the questions. I really support what Keith said in his opening. We've got lots of work to do in the criminal justice system to make it safer. And this death is a tragedy and was not necessary. But we are honor-bound under our ethical rules only to charge cases in which there's sufficient admissible evidence to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, and we believe it's there. To charge a case like this, would simply be wrong. And I really appreciate the courage and the commitment of the Attorney General and his staff and mine, buttressed by the opinion of Captain Ryan. This is not a fun part of our job. We try to make it as professional as we can, but our hearts still go out to the family. And we need to make a situation where these kinds of situations don't exist.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And let me thank again the family. Meeting with the family today was something that is essential to do. They have the right to transparency. They have the right to understand why. I just want to say I can't think of a more dignified family under the circumstances that they're in, and I just hope the community continues to rally around them and continues to demand that we have a fairer, better system. So with that, I think that's probably it.
Thank you.
We have brought you every developing detail in this case, but as you heard, no charges against that Minneapolis police officer, Mark Hanneman. I want to bring in Fox 9's Paul Bloom. He's inside of the newsroom in Minneapolis right now. And Paul, a major announcement in which we have been waiting on, and clearly the response not great from some communities.
And Daytona, I would just point out, as I listened into that news conference that was done right outside of our Hennepin County Government Center downtown, the courthouse, of course, headquarters for the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, and Mike Freeman. Mike Freeman today with the Attorney General Keith Ellison making this announcement. No charges in the deadly SWAT police shooting of Amir Locke on that raid in that downtown apartment building back on February 2nd. They just found, as they read the statutes, the law, precedential from the United States Supreme Court, that in this situation, Hanneman had the right, based on the totality of the circumstances, based on what he knew going in. Remember, they requested that no-knock search warrant out of fear. They were trying to look for armed murder suspects. This was an open case at the time, a homicide out of St. Paul, and Minneapolis went into that unit where Amir Locke appeared to be sleeping on the couch. It developed extremely quickly, but because Locke had a gun in his hand and raised it and pointed it at least in the direction of Hanneman, Freeman and Ellison ruled today that Hanneman was justified in opening fire.
It would be unethical for us to file charges in a case in which we know that we will not be able to prevail because the law does not support the charges.
Attorney General Keith Ellison and Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman with the final call. There will be no jury, no trial, no criminal charges for Minneapolis Police SWAT team member Mark Hanneman for killing Amir Locke during the execution of this no-knock search warrant early the morning of February 2nd.
We're not allowed to evaluate the case from the perspective of the victim.
Records show MPD demanded the use of the no-knock warrant to assist St. Paul police with what was then an open murder investigation, concerned about a high-risk entry while looking for potentially armed suspects. Previously released body camera footage capturing SWAT quietly using a key fob to gain entry to the 7th floor Bolero Flats unit, where it appeared Locke was sleeping on the couch. The officers announcing their presence and shouting commands as they pressed inside. The encounter lasting just seconds, with Locke raising a gun from under a blanket. The 22-year-old was not named in the warrant, nor was he ever considered a suspect in the murder, but prosecutors concluded he pointed the firearm towards Officer Hanneman, who then was legally justified to shoot.
I am not disappointed. I am disgusted.
Locke's mother absolutely furious about the charging decision, arguing that her son was a lawful gun owner, simply trying to protect himself.
You decided that he wasn't worth nothing but less than 9 seconds of a human being. And y'all think I'm about to be nice? That's why I'm not from Minnesota, because I'm not.
And clearly the Locke's family quest for justice will continue. Reverend Al Sharpton, right beside Karen Wells there, said his team would request that the U.S. Department of Justice take a look at this case. They absolutely believe race a factor in what transpired, and then this charging decision. Also the civil side, they've hired civil attorneys, including Ben Crump, also by Karen Wells' side there. That case would continue as well, Daytona. And one other interesting development today, and I think it really agitated that crowd of demonstrators that you showed a few minutes ago, is we learned today Mark Hanneman is back on the force, back on active duty, though the department said today he has not been assigned back to his assignment on the SWAT team.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question for you. What is next for Officer Hanneman, as well as the other officers who are there? They're still on the force, as far as I know. And then what's next for the Minneapolis Police Department? Because there was, from what I remember, Paul, I know it's been changing back and forth, a temporary moratorium on no-knock warrants. What's the latest with that with the city?
Yeah, well, a lot of things to unpack there. Yes, Hanneman back on the force. We're not sure about the other. It said 9 officers pushed into that apartment on the search warrant. It is our understanding, at least at this point, that none of them had been disciplined, that they remain on the force. As for the search warrants, that's what is super interesting coming out of this. Both Freeman and Ellison said while they couldn't charge Mark Hanneman here, if they could put no-knock search warrants on trial, it really felt like they wanted to. They basically put policymakers on notice here that to learn from this, to save other lives, and just ban the practice of those no-knock warrants. There's been some confusion exactly what department policy is and has been in Minneapolis over the last year plus out of Mayor Jacob Fry's office. But what I can tell you is new language goes into effect, in fact, Friday into the weekend, basically outlawing no-knock warrants in only in all cases except the most sort of time-sensitive, dangerous circumstances for officers. They're also adding language about announcing their presence, and that they would have to wait 20 or 30 seconds if it's a nighttime warrant at the door's threshold. As you see in that body camera footage with Amir Locke, the door opens, they move in, and as they're moving in, that's when they first announce their presence, giving Amir Locke mere seconds to sort of process it all. Now those officers in the same circumstance, that was a pre-dawn situation, so they would have to wait at that door at least 30 seconds before pressing inside.
Okay, so changes are going into effect, and we've brought experts on the show in the past saying that if they do in fact take away the option for no-knock warrants, that's a major asset for a lot of those police officers. But there is room for change, and I'm sure training still is going to be improved with the Minneapolis Police Department. They have quite the history out there. Last question for you, Paul. We're hearing, of course, that those protests are going to continue into Friday. Have you heard any other community reaction about this? The mother speaking out of Amir Locke, the family speaking out as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. Amir Locke's mom just happened to be at a civil rights conference this week put on by Reverend Al Sharpton's Action Network in New York City. She was with other mothers who had lost loved ones to police violence for a panel discussion today. So them getting the news today, she almost felt, she couldn't believe it if you've played out her full comments today, that it sort of happened while she's surrounded in this moment. As I mentioned, Sharpton and his group looking to take this case to the DOJ. As for the protests, I mean, what develops, the county attorney and the attorney general putting out a thorough report. It was backed up by an independent expert who reviewed the case. You saw in those protesters and demonstrators 15 to 20 very familiar faces to us all in that, quote unquote police accountability justice movement. So it hasn't seemed to reverberate outside of kind of that usual group, if you will, locally here. So we'll keep an eye on things. I know the ACLU is calling for Officer Hanneman's firing and immediate changes to no-knock search warrants. But I absolutely think here this no-knock search warrant, the momentum is there for change. And I would just point out to your viewers, now you talked about the change in Minneapolis, St. Paul, next door neighbor, I mean, a smaller city, but also an urban environment there. They haven't done no-knock warrants in at least 6 years. And the prosecutors were saying today, public safety, law enforcement efforts hasn't appeared to suffer in our capital city as a result. So the thought is Minneapolis could indeed implement this without too much trouble or difficulties in keeping their officers safe on the job.
Interesting. Fox 9's Paul Bloom live for us in Minneapolis. We appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks, Daytona.
Ken Belkin, friend of the program. Ken, good to see you. This is a really interesting case because you heard from Paul Bloom there. Because the weapon was drawn by Amir Locke as the officers executed this warrant, that was the justification for no charges. Does it go any further than that, or can we leave it at that?
Look, the fact of the matter is that these officers executed a lawful no-knock search warrant. They announced who they were. They were wearing clothing that indicated they were police officers. And yet Mr. Locke still, and he might have, it's a terrible tragedy what happened to him, and I'm sure he didn't look like he was very awake when it happened, but his first instinct was to pick up a gun and point it at the police. In any scenario where you put a police officer's life in danger such as that, you have to expect that they're going to be privileged to use deadly force in meeting that threat.
Let's talk, though, about, what recourse does the family have? Does the mother have? I'm expecting a pretty big lawsuit filed against the Minneapolis Police Department.
Yeah, it's a terrible tragedy. A mother lost her son, and nothing's going to bring him back. And I know she wants to see this officer punished, but not all tragedies result in criminal prosecutions. This was a terrible mistake. It was a terrible accident, but it was not criminal. There has to be a crime here, but there is liability on the civil side, and she could avail herself of the courts, which I'm sure she's going to, and bring a wrongful death lawsuit against the county, and maybe try on the legislative side to maybe get Minnesota to outlaw no-knock warrants the way it was done in Florida, Oregon, Tennessee, and Virginia.
Yeah, and of course, we heard in the media aftermath of this shooting, the city of Minneapolis putting somewhat of a temporary moratorium on no-knock search warrants. There was a lot of criteria and guidelines about what officers now need to do in the seconds and minutes before they execute these warrants. But this officer, Officer Mark Hanneman, what do you think he's facing? Do you think he's going to be, disciplined by the force? Do you think he's going to suffer any consequences in the workplace because of this?
Two things can be true. This can be a horrible tragedy, but at the same time, Officer Hanneman could have acted appropriately. And I think that's what's going on here. It's a tragedy, and we can't ignore the fact that it's a tragedy, but he did act appropriately. If you're a policeman entering a dangerous situation and someone picks up a gun and points it at you, what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to let him shoot you or one of your fellow officers before you act? I think they have to be privileged to be able to act, and they are legally allowed to act. I think the bigger question is, how appropriate are these no-knock warrants? And by the way, no-knock warrants are not something we've had for 100 years. This is something relatively recent. From 1963 was the Supreme Court case that set the precedent that allowed for these no-knock warrants.
So, Ken, just from a legal perspective and from a law enforcement perspective, I guess what is the rationale when you go execute a no-knock search warrant? You clearly do not know what is on the other side of the door. You don't know what situation will present itself. But as a maneuver for police, why is it even, policy and protocol for police departments to do this?
Well, unfortunately, the majority of these no-knock warrants happen to be part and parcel to the war on drugs, because the fear is that if you don't execute these warrants, and you give the person notice that you're going to be executing the warrant, that they could potentially destroy evidence, make evidence disappear, hide things better, all sorts of things. But the majority of these no-knock warrants are in drug cases, and sadly, the majority of them are involving marijuana.
Yeah, and it's just so unfortunate since the person they were executing the search warrant to was not Amir Locke. It's just a very, very tragic mistake. What will you be watching for in this case going forward now that, no charges, no trial, nothing?
Well, there's definitely going to be a civil rights lawsuit filed. I mean, her attorney, Mr. Crump, he's well renowned for filing these lawsuits, and he's very good at them. And I think, unfortunately, in our system of justice, what can be done here? The family can be financially compensated for the loss, which is really pales in comparison to a mother losing her son. But that is the system of justice we have. And hopefully, maybe more states can follow suit and see fit to outlaw these no-knock warrants, except in the most limited of circumstances.
Yeah, of course, we heard from the Hennepin County attorney, quote, insufficient admissible evidence to file criminal charges in this case. Ken Belkin, we appreciate your time. We'll talk to you again.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
Let me say, as we hear from the mother who was here in New York attending National Action Network's National Convention and got the word that there would not be charges against the police officer that killed Amir Locke. I went to Minneapolis and did the eulogy at his funeral and worked with this family, along with Attorney Ben Crump, who I call the Attorney General for Black America. And as many families join us today from around the country and stand with this mother as she gets this news that there will not be an indictment of this policeman. This is an example of why we cannot stop fighting for federal law, because this is a slap in the face to not only this mother and family, but to all of us. And we pledge out of National Action Network at our national convention that we're going to the Justice Department to review this case. There cannot be the allowance of no-knock laws nowhere in this country, whether it is this case or whether it's Breonna Taylor. It's all because we're dealing with states' rights legislation around no-knock laws. This young man was in his own home, laying down with a licensed gun, and he is killed, and their defense is self-defense. How do you defend yourself in my house when you don't have a legal right? The warrant did not have his name or apartment there. What are you defending yourself against? Breaking and entering into my house? So it must be federal law, and we want her to know that we're going to stand with her and go to the Justice Department and demand they review this. This is not over. The state made a decision, but the state will not close this case. We will fight with this family to get federal investigation on this case. This is why, right here at this convention, you have the family of Ahmaud Arbery, who would not stop with just a state case, but also demand the federal. They were able to get the state case in the same Minneapolis. So sometime it works, sometime it doesn't. That's why we need federal law. I want her to know we're standing with her, and we're going to make sure the Justice Department knows that we all over the country will demand the Locke case become a federal investigation. Before hearing from the mother, let me bring our Attorney General of Black America, who represents the family in this case, Ben Crump.
Thank you so much, Reverend Al, for always being our leader. And it is so ironic that it would happen here at the National Action Network Convention, where Karen Locke, the mother of Amir Locke, were joining other family members, mostly black mothers who had their children killed unjustly, and she was coming to try to talk about how to be supportive of them and them to bond together. Unbeknownst to her, Reverend Al, that at the very moment she's preparing to come downstairs, she gets the news that they're not going to charge the police officer for breaking into the house in the wee hours of the morning while her son is asleep. He's so asleep that the cop kicks the couch twice to wake him up. He immediately wakes up not knowing who they are, and he's a law-abiding citizen. He's never had a criminal history, has a permit to carry a gun. He goes to protect himself. Where is the Second Amendment supporters for black people who have a right to bear arms? Where's the NRA? They should be outraged. It shouldn't just be the National Action Network. They keep promoting Second Amendment gun rights to protect your home, to protect your sanctuary. Well, that applies to black people too. Her son was one of those people who had every right to the Second Amendment. And when we think about these no-knock warrants, before you hear from Karen, who is heartbroken, her and Amir's father, Amir Locke, they are heartbroken. And she's going to tell you in her words, as only a black woman can, how frustrating this is, that, you know, they break into the house after they got this unjustifiable, unnecessary, unconstitutional no-knock warrant for property. I mean, this is what they call themselves breaking into the apartment for. It's an affront to the Fourth Amendment rights against unlawful, unreasonable searches and seizures. We saw it with Breonna Taylor. Now we see it in Minneapolis. Reverend Al, after Breonna Taylor was mutilated, 9 bullets in her body while she was practically naked, everybody looked at these no-knock warrants and who they were being executed against. 82% of the time when a judge signed a warrant saying you can bust in the house, it was against a black person, Joe. I mean, it's like they don't bust in white people's houses in the middle of the night with guns drawn, because they know people wouldn't stand for it. But yet they think it's okay to do that to African American families. We believe it's going to be very similar in Minneapolis when they finally provide the data of who houses they're breaking into in the wee hours of the morning. And just think about it for a second. Somebody breaks into your house. You don't know who they are. You are started in the middle of the night, which they say is the worst time to execute a no-knock warrant, because you're waking up, you don't know what's going on, and any law-abiding citizen, it is foreseeable, is going to try to protect themselves. And so then, Rachel, the police say, well, it was a life-or-death situation, and the police had to shoot because it was a life-or-death situation. But they created the life-or-death situation. That's what they're not telling you as they try to justify this. There was nothing wrong with executing this warrant like they executed against white citizens. You knock, you announce, people know who you are and what you're there for. But black people, they kick in the door and expect us to just say, whoever's coming through our door, we don't know if they're burglarizing us as a home invasion. Don't try to protect yourself. Where Amir tried to protect himself. And for that there he's dead. And the NRA should be joining us saying we got to get rid of these no-knock warrants. Right. Because if it can happen to Amir, it can happen to Breonna Taylor, it can happen to your children too. Her heart is heavy. Attorney Tony Ramanucci, Attorney Jeff Storms, we put forth a statement talking about how Mayor Fry in Minneapolis, after George Floyd, they said we're not doing any more no-knock warrants. But I think this was number 71, Karen. So if you're not doing no-knock warrants, how does Amir Locke get killed during the execution of a no-knock warrant? Explain that. And that's why we're here. And that's why we're not giving up on getting justice for Amir Locke. His mother and father, their family are not. not giving up. And she's going to tell you that they are never going to give up. So without further ado, Ms. Karen Wells, the mother of Amir Locke. And we'll take some of your questions at the end.
I'm starting to believe that they knew I was coming to the convention today. So I almost feel like this was a setup. You couldn't wait until next week. You couldn't wait until Friday. So once again, Minneapolis, you're showing your true colors of actually who you are and who you represent. I'm not going to give up. Right now, the Minneapolis police officer that executed my baby boy on 2/2/22, be prepared for this family, because every time you take a step, we're going to be right behind you. This is not over. You may have been found not guilty, but in the eyes of me, being the mother who I am, you are guilty. And I'm not going to give up. Continue to have your restless nights, because I know you do. You're probably restless before they decided to not charge you today, but you're going to continue to be restless because the spirit of my baby is going to haunt you for the rest of your life. Wow. I am not disappointed. I am disgusted with the city of Minneapolis. Very disgusted. I'm to the point to where I want to take back the residency of both my sons from that city. Even though my son, on his birth certificate, what? Let's take off Maplewood, Minnesota. I don't want him to be remembered for a city that we embraced and raised our children in, and then you decided in less than 9 seconds to take my baby's life? And you think that you just go walk around and have a regular life, and I'm not? I'm going to mourn my son for the rest of my days on earth until I'm united with my baby. That's not fair. It's not fair that I had to go and pick up ashes of my baby from my niece because I was too distraught to pick his ashes up. Did you think I was going to bury my son in the ground of the place that murdered him? No, wherever I go, my baby's going. I don't live in the Twin Cities. I left the Twin Cities. I took my son with me when I left the Twin Cities, and there was a reason for us not to be there. My son was protecting himself, thinking he had to protect himself from all the crime that is out of control, Mayor Fry, the mayor of Minneapolis, that you can't control. So my son decided that if he's going to go back and forth and do Instacart and DoorDash, he needed to bear arms the legal way. He listened to myself and his father. He did the right thing. But at the end of the day, the Second Amendment doesn't matter to him. He has too much melanin. So maybe if it was a little lighter melanin, maybe they would have gave him a de-escalation stages of a chance to drop the weapon. Wow. But you had enough time before my baby went and reached for his weapon. If you had time to kick a couch 2 times, not one, but twice, you had time to de-escalate the situation of my melanin black son. Right.
My Lord.
Now, you're going to have to deal with me. I've never been Minnesota nice, and I'm not from Minnesota. And I said that from the first day that I stepped soil on that city. I am not Minnesota nice. You got something different right here. I'm from a different state. We stand up. We speak up. This is who his mother is. I'm not going nowhere. Anytime I come back to the States, you're going to hear about me. Minneapolis, Minnesota. Know who I am. I cannot, can you imagine knowing that you'll never get to see your 22-year-old baby ever again?
My God.
It is not right that it took me 10 hours to bring Amir into this evil, racist, unjust world. And then in less than 9 seconds, a police officer who had the record, not my son, he's the one that has the record. Why don't y'all go pull him up to see all the complaints that he has against him? Because my son ain't got no complaints on him. That's right. You decided that he wasn't worth nothing but less than 9 seconds of a human being. And y'all think I'm about to be nice? That's why I'm not from Minnesota, because I'm not. So get ready, because with the backings of these two and the other attorneys, we're coming. We're coming full force. And I'm not going to stop racing this race and running the race until I cross that finish line.
All right. All right. We're going to take some of your questions. Also, his aunt, Linda, is also with us today. You know, and what Karen said, it's very important to put it in context. He, like many young Americans, was trying to do everything the right way. He was delivering for DoorDash. And that's why he went and got his permit to carry a firearm to protect himself. But just as Karen said, I really believe they don't think the Second Amendment applies to African Americans, because we know without a shadow of a doubt, had this been a young white man with no criminal history, a law-abiding citizen to carry a weapon, and the police busted open his door, lightning would be striking and thunder would be rolling. But they seem to say, no, everything is justified if it's a black person, and it is not justified. Rev, do you have anything else to add before we take questions? Any questions?
What's your message to the mayor of Minneapolis?
Well, I think, and before Karen addresses this, and you got to think, this is a mother who is grieving. The wounds are still fresh. I think when they say they have policies, that they should follow the policies. There shouldn't have been any no-knock warrants being executed. And so this is something that they have to address honestly. It has to be transparency at every level now. We need to know who were those no-knock warrants being executed against, and was it disproportionately executed against African Americans, as many people believe. That's what he can do right now, immediately. But I think Karen has a...
Let me add to that before Karen speaks. Part of our going National Action Network on behalf of the Locke family with the attorneys to the feds is to investigate not only the killing of young Brother Locke, but why they put the no-knock law to the side and killed him in the first place. The police department of Minneapolis, Mr. Mayor, and the shenanigans need to be investigated on why this was allowed to happen. Let us not forget, in the same Minneapolis that she addressed, they claimed all kind of reforming of policing after George Floyd. They even legislated they were going to eliminate policing. You went from George Floyd that we're not going to have policing and we're going to defund, all the way to shooting Amir Locke in his bed with a no-knock warrant. You have undone everything you did in trying to deal with the aftermath of George Floyd, and that's why we're going to stand with this mother and family to get justice and a thorough investigation of who decided to go backwards on no-knock and who decided to go backwards on policing in Minneapolis.
Yes. Karen.
The answer to your question, the thing that I would say to Mayor Fry is, if you're running a city and the people below you disrespect your authority, your policy, that says a lot about those people that entered into that unit that day. Mm-hmm. They don't care because they feel like they can do whatever they want to do. He has my phone number. So now if Mayor Fry wants to meet with me, we can discuss and we can talk about banning the no-knock warrant in Minnesota in the name of Amir Locke. That's what we could talk about. because there's nothing else you can say to me. I don't want to hear that you're sorry. I don't want to hear about your little condolences. That's not going to bring my baby back. So give me something that's going to justify the execution of my baby. Then we can talk. But until then, we don't have nothing to say to each other.
Wow. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
On another topic, if that's okay.
That's fine. Let's step back.
To either you or the Reverend, how do you feel about the statements that were made, recorded statements from the Clark, New Jersey mayor? Racist statements that he had made?
I think the statements speak for themselves. I think that anytime someone that is holding office can be directly lined up with this kind of bigotry, the citizens have a right to call for him to be recalled or to step aside because they did not have the knowledge of these kind of feelings when he was elected. People can misspeak and apologize, but people cannot hide who they are, and when it comes out later, say, well, that was then, this is now, and I'm going to stay right where I am. People have a right, since they have more information, to ask for accountability.
What do you think of the lengths they went to cover this up?
I think that the length, anyway, so you cannot now take any apologies sincerely, because if you were sincerely apologetic, you wouldn't have tried to cover up what you had done. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Al.
You all were tracking for the past 2 years had to be canceled because of COVID. This is all about celebrating the resiliency and the dedication of our wounded, ill, and injured active duty and veteran U.S. and allied service members. We're very excited to be able to get the games back in play again at the end of the summer, and we're looking forward to seeing these warriors compete. So with that, we'll go with questions. Bob.
Thank you, John. On the subject of U.S. security assistance for Ukraine, I think the Secretary mentioned yesterday during his testimony that the Ukrainians are going to get both the 300 and 600 versions of the Switchblade drones. And I'm wondering, can you say whether either or both of those are in production, or is this something that has to be, I mean, by that, what I meant was, are they in stockpiles, or are they available, or do they have to be ordered? And also, what about training on that kind of a equipment? Does that require training?
So we've already sent in 100 Switchblade UAVs that were already in our stocks. We sent them in. from those stocks. I don't know where they are in the transshipment process, but they arrived over the earlier this week. So they'll be getting into Ukraine quickly if they aren't already there. That's the 100 that President Biden. We're in discussions with the Ukrainians about future usages of drones, and of course we'll keep that option open going forward. I'd rather not get into specifics about each shipment in terms of what variant of the Switchblade, but we're going to keep talking to them and working with and helping them get additional ones if they need it. Now, this is not a system that the Ukrainians typically use, so there is going to need to be a little bit of training. It is not an individual could be suitably trained on how to use the Switchblade drone in about 2 days or so. So when you heard the Secretary and the Chairman talk yesterday about some training that was being done for Ukrainian military members, that's what they were referring to. They were referring to Ukrainian soldiers who were already in the United States and had been since the fall, since well before the invasion, for military educational purposes, professional military training. And we took the opportunity to having them still in the country to give them a couple of Switchblades so that they can go back, and they will be going back soon, back home, to train others in the Ukrainian military. And we'll look at that doesn't have to be the end all of it. I mean, we'll look at other suitable opportunities if needed to provide more training on the Switchblades if it's necessary. But that's what they were referring to yesterday.
So there is either version in full production so that you could readily supply additional?
Well, I can't. I'm not going to speak for the manufacturers. I understand it. They are capable of manufacturing both of these versions, and just bigger warhead than the other, and potentially penetrating capabilities for, say, armor targets. I won't speak for the manufacturer or what their production line is. My understanding is that production line is open. They're capable of producing these. Again, we're not going to get into specifics on a day-to-day basis of exactly what variant is going in on any given day, but it is a useful a battlefield system. We're going to do everything we can to and that they can continue to get into the country. Right now, 100 have flown or have flowed in, and we'll see where it goes from there.
But John, you're confirming that the 600 version has been authorized and is either en route or soon will be on route?
No, I have not. What I've said is I'm not going to talk about the specific variant of it. It is, but if you're asking me, can I rule out that the 600 version, the heavier warhead version, will not be used or won't be sent? No, I'm not going to rule that out.
And in terms of javelins, the $100 million in javelins, Tony Blinken over the weekend had said that the Ukrainians had received 10 times of javelins to the amount of tanks, Russian tanks, in the country. He said that on one of the Sunday shows. Why do they need so many more javelins right now? I'm a little confused about that.
Well, I mean, you don't just send a system in based on one potential target. It is an anti-armor design. It's a missile designed for anti-armor use for those kinds of targets, but it doesn't mean you have to exclusively use it to hit tanks. It can be used on other vehicles as well, and even fixed targets if need be. And there have been thousands of javelins that we have provided to Ukraine, and we know they're using them. You can see the evidence for yourself when you look at the videos and the images on TV of these burnt-out tanks and burnt-out trucks and armored personnel carriers. You can see the work of the javelin right there. So we're not. You don't count one to one because they're not being used in that capacity. Yeah.
Thank you, Don. I have two questions on